Hey guys, welcome back. I did record a video a couple days ago, but it turns out with your phone that when you open the camera app and then you hit record and switch to Google Chrome, whatever, it actually stops recording. So I read like an hour or so content and nothing recorded. So I have to do this again. I'm gonna pick up where we left off. I hope you guys enjoyed the last one. Again, I do apologize for being so short. I had some guests come in, so I wasn't able to continue longer than 10 minutes. But I do plan on making this at least an hour or so to kind of speed up a little bit and get into chapter 4. But nonetheless, let's get started. So poverty, disrupted households and families, unaffordable housing, education, and medical care would haunt such a minority. It would become capitalism's business cycle shock absorber, the last hired first fired across the 4 to 7 year average duration of its cycles. For capitalism, making such a minority absorb most of the costs of capitalism's instability allowed the majority of the working class to be relatively exempted, relieved, freed from them. The majority could be less subject to cycles because the minority was made relatively much more subject. Capitalism promised the majority relatively secure jobs and incomes because it took those away from the minority. The majority could thus worry less about this next cycle, whereas the minority had to worry about more and adjust their lives more. Racists could then attribute the resulting differences between minority and majority subparts of a population to inherent qualities of different races instead. Other advanced capitalist countries found parallel solutions. Some condemned immigrants to play the role assigned to African Americans in the United States. Racism aimed at immigrants often followed, and cyclical upswings, immigrants would be brought in. North Africans to France, Southern Italians into Switzerland, Turks into Germany, and so on. Then, cyclical downswings would return those immigrants to their home countries. Capitalism would thus save on costs of unemployment insurance, welfare payments, etc., for the workers who had returned. While some capitalists relied on domestic minorities to be shock absorbers and others relied on immigrants, some countries relied on both. The United States used Central American immigrants alongside domestic African Americans, and it still does. Germany allowed some immigrants to settle and acquire German citizenship alongside Turkish and other immigrant guest workers. In the United States, married white women also played the role of business cycle shock absorber. During cyclical upswings, they would enter the paid labor force and part-time or full-time positions. Like African Americans, they earned less than the white man. Women's jobs, too, were likely to be temporary, undone by cyclical downturns. Whatever communities were forced into, the shock absorber role, poverty, depression, broken families, slums, and inadequate education and health facilities became more widespread among them than they were among the majority of the working class. Insecure jobs, incomes, homes, and lives often bred bitterness, envy, depression, crime, and violence. These collateral damages had to be managed by the capitalisms whose survival depended on producing and reproducing those communities. Police and prisons were and are assigned that management task. Police and prisons were to keep the lid on and tame, patrol, and control the restive portions of the shock absorber communities sequestered in slums or ghettos. Interactions with police coupled with cycling and recycling through prisons were the chosen means to manage capitalism's collateral damage. Those means generated collateral damage of their own. The long, tragic record of police violence, use of excessive force, the harshness and violence of incarceration, and the killing especially of African Americans. Why were African Americans chosen to be key, but not the only, cyclical shock absorber in the United States? One factor concerned the racist legacies of U.S. slavery. They included beliefs that slaves were either not fully human or inferior humans. Even the U.S. Constitution had counted a slave as merely the 3/5 of a full, i.e., white, person for census purposes. And brief pause, what they're referring to is in the Constitution that's now removed was something called the 3/5 clause, which said that African Americans were, quote, 3/5 of a person. So, accommodation to slavery before the U.S. Civil War had already shaped a racialized consciousness on both masters and slaves. And because U.S. slavery entailed different skin colors for masters and slaves, unlike many slaveries in world history, a readily identified minority had already been defined in racial terms in the slave portions of the United States. Moreover, that definition had spread to other parts of the United States as well. U.S. capitalism absorbed and built on slavery's legacy by inserting large portions of the African American community into the shock absorber role that the system required. The racism developed by U.S. slavery thereby both facilitated U.S. capitalism and was reinforced by it. A significant portion of the white working class in all capitalisms has always also been forced into the shock absorber role. White trash in U.S. capitalism was never far from the African Americans similarly situated. There thus arose possibilities of class solidarity between these black and white working class communities. U.S. history displays moments when those possibilities were realized, as C. Van Woodward documented so well. It also displays moments of intense racist violence used to block the realization of those possibilities. Employers played on racialized differences to keep employees from unifying against them, and bitter competitions between black and white shock absorbers for cyclically scarce jobs. Whites could and often did use racism to gain advantages and access to those jobs. In multiple ways. Then, capitalism fostered and benefited from racism. It thus settled deeply into the system. Fundamental injustice characterized the relationship between police and prisons. On the one hand, in the African American and other communities, for example, indigenous people of color, condemned to play capitalism's shock absorber role on the other. The solution was and is not better training or more funding. Both have been tried repeatedly and both have likewise failed repeatedly. A real solution would provide a decently paid job to everyone who wants one as a matter of right. Unemployment would then be outlawed much like slavery, child abuse, etc. Taxes levied on capitalist enterprises would provide the funds needed to find jobs, private or public, for those laid off by an employer, much as such taxes help fund unemployment insurance now. Those funds would include wages or salaries paid for each worker's time between being laid off and rehired. Minimum wages applied universally would cover reasonable housing, transport, healthcare, and other living costs. If such a solution were deemed to be incompatible with capitalism as a system, capitalism would have to give way to a new system that made adequately paid employment a basic right for all. Enterprise profit would then finally be ejected from its throne, as capitalism's number one social priority. Such a solution would finally free African Americans, indigenous, and brown people from long-standing abuses and by police and prisons. It would thus reduce the racism that those institutions have exemplified and reinforced. It would also reduce pressures on police and prison personnel to behave in ways that self-destructively rob them of their humanity as well as oppress others. Police and prisons in the United States today serve an inherently unstable capitalism by means of systemic racism. The logic of alliance between anti-racism and anti-capitalism cannot be cleared. Next up, brick and mortar crumbling. The COVID-19 pandemic has cemented Amazon's dominant position. But now, all the lonely people, where do they all come from? So wondered the Beatles famously today's answer would be from isolation in front of computers. In recent years, millions of customers have lost interest in and abandoned malls across America, not to mention more traditional brick-and-mortar storefronts that make cities like New York so vibrant. And this is actually not wrong because, I live about roughly half an hour away from like two different malls, and they're really not that busy. I mean, you have a Friday night or Saturday, maybe a little popping here and there, but other than that, malls are dying off. It's why you have 82 different online websites to purchase your goods, electronics, even sometimes, food if you want. So I have seen a huge decline in activity at the malls, which I think is a result of Amazon and other big online retailers. So, well before the coronavirus hit, many commercial strips had been reeling, and malls had been collapsing into bankruptcy by the thousands. Shoppers increasingly saved money and time by ordering from home via the internet and getting package deliveries. When they did venture out, it was often to big box stores. During the last few months, huge numbers of smaller stores have closed. Walmarts and Targets have been open, and online shopping has become ever more widespread, accelerating an Amazonification of America that had already been well underway. What do we do about this would largely determine whether we still have functioning public commercial spaces in this country, or whether we fold up our tent and accept that relatively efficient and expected delivery of goods straight to the home will dominate our retail economy for generations to come. Now, what he means by Amazonification is, for example, like Whole Foods and some of these other market stores or even small town bookstores are being bought over by Amazon. And that's what Amazonification means, is that we're going to buy up these stores. They're going to be under our control now, and we're going to do whatever we want. But we're also building more warehouses across the country, even like a second headquarters not too long ago. And they're getting so much power, political power and influence, and with being almost $1 trillion company, they can afford to buy over these mom and pop shops and basically a full-on monopoly, which it already is. So the answer matters mightily. Many have forgotten this, but markets are not just places where we go to get goods. They are a defining characteristic of civilization as we know it. Once, isolated households were self-sufficient in most ways, each producing what it needed to survive. Then, a division of labor slowly evolved. People learned that when each household produced just one or a few products, a community of households could achieve a greater total output of goods and services. That enabled higher standards of consumption and living. To achieve them, communities needed some institution, a council of elders, a chief, a religious or secular leader, etc., to distribute each household's output to all the others who wanted to consume it. Sometimes that institution was a market, where goods and services were distributed by means of exchanges among producers and consumers. Trips to markets became passages into community, leaving isolation at least temporarily. People in markets enjoyed personal contacts and socialized activities. They found friends, lovers, and partners, and came to discuss and act together to solve shared problems. Their influence went far beyond this function. Villages, towns, and cities grew up around markets. People overcame isolation not only by buying from one another, they also bought their workplaces and schools, as well as their homes. Near to markets both to work and shop more easily, and for all the social connections and interactions markets fostered. Modern society has been shaped, indispensably, by markets and their evolution. It will be deeply affected if real markets mostly vanish, replaced by merely electronic, virtual forms. We are now living through a remarkable moment in the history of markets, and therefore in the history of contemporary civilization. Countless shopping places inside malls and on cities, high streets, keep disappearing. In their place, Amazon, Walmart, and a few other giant dominant, pleasing us with their price and selection and efficiency, but letting us down in so many other ways. We are becoming siloed, isolated again in households, this time staring at computer screens and opening packages. Social indications show that we are understandably lonely and becoming lonelier. This year's lockdown, aiming to contain the pandemic, has only intensified that process, putting mega retailers who dominate the internet even more firmly in the catbird seat. Where do we go from here? Is there any way we can reestablish the centrality of common shopping spaces? If not, what will happen to our communities as we know them, and to our sense of ourselves? Well, the answer lies in an economic principle about competition within markets themselves. Typically, the producer able to charge the lowest price for a good or service in the market will win the competition among sellers to find buyers. That is because buyers will flock to that producer and abandon others, losers, and its competition. Winners grow and losers die. Winners often buy the losers, equipment and facilities, and hire some of the losers' laid off workers. In short, winners absorb losers. This repeats until one seller is left in each market. Competition destroys itself, becomes the opposite. Hence, a monopoly. Having no competition, nowhere else for buyers to go, monopolies can raise their prices far beyond the product's cost, and thereby realize monopoly profits. But then, the process switches into reverse. High monopoly profits lure other capitalists. They seek to enter monopolized markets, and if when they do, monopoly self-destructs, to return to competition, and that competition, once returned, will eventually resume its evolution into monopoly. In capitalism, therefore, competition and monopoly are opposites that produce one another as sequential market faces. If we are lucky, and this basic economic narrative holds, internet behemoths and more authentic, close to brick home mortar stores may exhibit a parallel sequence. Internet sellers deliver a vast array of products at prices lower than what storekeepers can charge. What department stores had earlier done to some specialty stores, internet sellers have done to malls and other retailers. By attracting buyers, internet shopping is defeating brick and mortar stores. It is fast absorbing their equipment, physical space, and some of their firm or family employers. There are other reasons for this. Because average U.S. wages have been stagnant for decades, prices have become ever more important to buyers. Then the coronavirus pandemic made matters worse. As government bailouts allowed millions to become unemployed, they have focused even more on price. As government directives have urged them to stay at home, they have valued delivery even more. When retail stores collapse, the wealth lost in jobs, businesses, invested capital, and by surrounding communities dependent on them far exceeds the added profits of the Internet's major corporate sellers. Under capitalism's usual rules, those sellers have no obligation to compensate those who suffer on the other side. So is the march of traditional retail to extinction inevitable? Or might this be another phase, one ultimately leading to another chapter of a monopoly and competition? I think there's hope for retail as long as we have known it for. From mom and pop stores to franchises to malls, if they take the necessary steps, they can offer shoppers benefits that the Internet cannot. The problem is not unsolvable, nor need we stand hopelessly by as the logic of capitalism dictates painfully switches back and forth from one shopping system to another. Policy can intervene to achieve a democratically decided choice of commercial opportunities for buyers as well as sellers. Those steps begin with a basic recognition, one that we have long since forgotten. Buyers suffer a heavy, non-monetary loss when they shift to Internet shopping. The key word to describe the loss is loneliness, long a growing problem in the U.S. We spend ever more time before screens on computers, smartphones, and TVs. Shopping face-to-face has long been very different. As has been known since at least Socrates' time, humans are social animals. People gather in groups to exist in nature, to reproduce and raise families, to enjoy goods and services that cannot be produced by isolated individuals but only by groups or collected efforts. Sports, dances, restaurants, and most other entertainments require people to gather in groups. Escaping loneliness has always been a major part of what we enjoy about activities with others. Going to markets and malls, at county fairs, along Fifth Avenue, and at tag sales overcomes loneliness. We probably can't continue self-fighting forever. Likely sooner than later, Americans will react to their worsened loneliness. Vanilla politicians tap into this when they advocate reopening America. Despite serious viral risks, we ultimately want to venture out and have contact with one another, for the same reasons that isolated farmers went on market day to gather with one another. That shy teenagers had reasons of their own to do likewise, that older people maintained lifelong friendships and started new ones. The Internet is far better for selling goods than selling services precisely because services are, by definition, more about interpersonal interactions. So traditional retail spaces need to focus more on services and goods, and more on the service aspects of goods than on the goods themselves. Buying a service from another person is likewise getting it, and that is much less lonely than buying a good via the Internet. At the same time, our commercial centers need to become sites, made rigorously safe and healthy. For all manners of arts, crafts, and other engaging spectacles, many commercial shops already do this, but more need to follow their example. Places need to be established in and around brick-and-mortar stores for political debates, speeches, organizing, all of which nourish us in ways we don't appreciate. Inside our adjacent sports facilities need to be readily available. Stalls for temporary stores need to be interspersed with permanent stores so as to maximize continuously new and different shopping possibilities. Rather than letting our shopping strips and malls wither and die, we need to commit to making them rich, diverse, unique gathering places that ennoble and uplift and excite people in ways that big box stores and internet retail simply cannot, no matter how hard they try. Of course, historic opportunities require collective planning and collective actions. Most leaders of U.S. fear such collective undertakings led by the only institutions capable of achieving them, local, regional, and national governments. So they may fail to solve a major social problem in the U.S., it would not be the first time. Next, profiting off of the suffering of millions. I would like to address the stark level of injustice that is shocking even for me. And I watch these things more than I probably should. Over the last 15 or 16 weeks, over 52 million Americans filed for unemployment. They are using up their savings, if they're lucky to have any, or leaning on relatives, friends, and communities for support. they are worried sick about whether their jobs will still be there when the economy picks back up. And, if so, whether their salary and working conditions will be that same. Unfortunately, millions of those jobs have disappeared forever. What a mess of suffering that could have been avoided. Kids don't learn, teachers can't teach, people who want can't do or can't, and millions of others are locked indoors. But I want you to think about those who can, those who can make a lot of money off the limits that hold us back. We permit in this society a vast injustice in which huge numbers of our fellow citizens suffer while a few cash in. I'm not talking about making honest profits. I'm talking about making record sums off the suffering of others. Let me give some examples to those of you that have morals and ethics, religious or not. The United States Treasury has recently listed the companies that received money under the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. The relief funds that went into effect here in the United States to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, over $500 billion, $521 billion to be exact, were dispersed under this program, and recent media releases have indicated that well-connected people, friends of politicians, big businesses, supporters of Mr. Trump, and all sorts of everyday corruption were involved here too. JP Morgan Chase recently and proudly announced their record profits while most Americans suffered the pandemic and plus capitalism's crash. Amazon suddenly got a burst of business. The good part of that is at least some more people got jobs delivering when we can't go to the store to buy anymore. But then they've charged so much for the delivery that they're not only get the extra money to pay the extra people, but they beefed up their profits. And of course, just a little pause and quick example of all this. I'm sure a lot of you guys, for probably the past couple years, have downloaded DoorDash, downloaded Grubhub, downloaded Uber Eats, whatever. It's really kind of stunning sometimes, kind of astonishing, like how they're able to raise the prices so fucking high that when you go to do your final purchase, on top of your tip, it's double or triple more than it should be. And it's so, and you know, Americans and maybe some others are so desperate they're willing to pay the extra money to have it delivered instead of going out to eat. Now, thankfully, with kind of the tides turning and people going back out again, it's not as terrible, but still, I think the idea of taking a fucking meal that's $11.50 at a restaurant and making it $13.50 to delivery, that's a bit ridiculous. Moving forward. And they do it with a big smile. And if it's the American way to make a buck off the suffering of others, isn't that the capitalist dream? Maybe. But as George Carlin once said, if you believe in the American dream, you know why it's called the American dream. Because you gotta be asleep to believe it. Now, I want to correct that because that's actually wrongly stated. And George Carlin's segment on Americans, at the end it's stated, and quote, they know why it's called the American dream. Because you have to be asleep to believe it. So I kind of wanted to correct how it's actually said. But I think he had to reward it just to have it make sense in the way he wrote the book. So United Health, a major national medical insurance company, had them before, recently reported record profits. That was bad enough. We've had record unemployment, record suffering, a record number of people going to food banks, a record number of people, and United Health is making record profits? My antenna went up, so I read the explanation of why profits were soaring that United Health provided to the press. It was something I would not prepare for. It turns out that the record numbers of Americans were terrified about the virus, understandably. So much so that even when they felt unwell, they chose not to visit a doctor, clinic, or hospital. One reason was fear of being near people who had COVID-19. Another reason was the need to save money on costly deductibles and copays by postponing treatment or just waiting for the pain to pass. So millions who needed it did not get medical care. For the insurance company, this was great news. They kept getting paid for their usual premiums for health insurance, but their payers feared to use it. Lower costs, higher profits, and one very happy insurer. Folks, that's outrageous. That is neither necessary nor appropriate. This company could have left with its usual profit and might have even said that it didn't want extra when it's known to derive from people not getting health care, risking bigger health problems by postponing treatment. United Health could have understood that they have no right to get more profit out of the suffering of millions. But such thoughts seem scarce among CEOs of most capitalist corporations. Profiteering off the misery of others is not something any decent society needs to prevent. The reason it occurs is the system. The PPP loans are a case in point. when the government gives money to a business, it does not give that money to everyone in the business. The government money goes to the people who run the business, and that's not the same thing. Those who run the business are a tiny group of people at the top, the owner, if it's a little company, or if a board of directors if it's a big corporation. The major shareholders of big corporations select the people on the board and therefore govern pretty much what they do. Owners and directors together are a tiny minority of all the people involved in the business. Most, of course, are employees. So, government money is given to the tiny minority of folks at the top of recipient companies, and that minority decides how to use it. No one knows exactly what the PP money will be used for, because that is the purview of a private business run by that tiny minority. They might use it, if they cannot recover from the pandemic, in all kinds of ways that feather their nest, and do nothing for the employees, who are left wondering whether their jobs will ever resume. The irony is that the PPP is ultimately paid by the taxpayer. We all get to help pay for a program that gives money to a tiny minority who will decide how to use it, whether indeed, in the longer run, our paychecks will be protected. Yet, we're all going through the pandemic together. So we've been told. That corruption does not lie in the people who are connected, snatching more than they ought to. Of course, that goes on. But that's based in our system. The much deeper and much more pervasive corruption is allowing the existence of such a system, one that allows a tiny minority of people at the top to make all the decisions, governing who has a job, how much money they earn, the condition of their job, and the security of their job. Meanwhile, the mass of peoples is passive. We don't live under a real democracy, nor have we ever. How difficult would it be if each person working in each enterprise had an equal vote about what to do with the government money intended to help us all? Well, we could decide, in a truly democratic manner, how best to get that enterprise through the pandemic and the crash. The system is the problem. Until we change the system, we will see this kind of corruption surface and persist throughout our lifetimes and those of our children. Next up, the consequences of inequality can be fatal. Capitalism, as Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century shows, relentlessly worsens wealth and income inequalities. That inherent tendency is only occasionally stopped or reversed when masses of people rise up against it. That happened, for example, in Western Europe and the U.S. during the 1930s Great Depression. It prompted social democracy in Europe and the New Deal in the United States. So far, in capitalism's history, however, stoppages or reversals around the world proved temporary. The last half-century witnessed a neoliberal reaction that rolled back both of European social democracy and the New Deal. Capitalism always managed to resume its tendential movement toward greater inequality. Among the consequences of a system with such a tendency, many are awful. We are living through one now as the COVID-19 pandemic, inadequately contained by the U.S. system, savages Americans of middle and lower incomes and wealth markedly more than the rich. The rich buy better healthcare and diets, second homes away from crowded cities, better connections, to get government bailouts, and so on. Many of the poor homeless, tasteless advice to shelter at home is for them absurd. Low-income people are often crowded into the kinds of dense housing and dense working conditions that facilitate infection. Poor residents of low-cost nursing homes die disproportionately. As do prison inmates, mostly poor, pandemic capitalism distributes death in adverse proportion to wealth and income. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about nursing homes and how a lot of that was handled during COVID-19, you can look at Andrew Cuomo's, former governor of New York's handling of the nursing home. I recommend take a look into that to see how it went down over there and kind of compare it to your own state as well. Just a little piece of fun there. So social distancing has destroyed especially low-wage service sector jobs. Rarely did top executives lose their positions, and when they did, they found others. The result is widening gaps between high salaries for some and low or no wages for many. Unemployment invites employers to lower wages for the still employed because they can. Pandemic capitalism has provoked a massive increase in money creation by central banks. That money fuels rising stock markets and thereby enriches the rich who own most shares. The coincidence of rising stock markets and mass unemployment plus falling wages only adds momentum to worsening inequality. Now, I'll smell a couple things. Number one, when Richard Wolff talks about employers, CEOs, or even those who are on the board of directors go from, one job to the next, or, they leave the company, give it a few years, and come back. Well, what happens when they leave is what I like to call a golden parachute. As in, hey, you may bankrupt the company, but here's $20 million, have fun. Or hey, this couple board of directors have to go for some scandal or whatever. We'll give you a nice $5 to $10 million package on your way out. That's called a golden parachute for what he's referencing to. And the other thing too about the stock shares. If you check out show Democracy at Work or Economic Update on YouTube, and he does have it on their platforms as well, he mentions all the time that the richest folks, those with, or even big families who have the wealth to invest in shares and stocks, they're the ones who own it all. There's some people who are middle class or whatever who might have some shares here and there, but we're not making nearly as much, and it's not. And when the stocks go, when the stock crashes, we lose money, but they hurt even more because they're the ones with the most investment. So, little piece in there too. So, unequal distributions, economic distribution. So, income and wealth finance unequal political outcomes. Whenever a small minority enjoys concentrated wealth within a society committed to universal suffrage, the rich quickly understand their vulnerability. The non-wealthy majority can use universal suffrage to prevail politically. The majority's political power could then undo the results of the economy, including its unequal distribution of income and wealth. The rich corrupt politics with their money to prevent exactly that outcome. Capitalists spend part of their wealth to preserve and enlarge all their wealth. The rich and those eager to join them, and the U.S. dominant within both Republican and Democratic parties. The rich provide most of the donations that sustain candidates and parties, the funding for armies and lobbyists, advising legislators, the bribes, and many issued oriented political public campaigns. The laws and regulations that flow from Washington, states, and cities reflect the needs and desires of the rich far more than the rest of us. The peculiar structure of U.S. property taxes offers an example, and the U.S. property is divided into two kinds, tangible and untangible. Tangible property includes land, buildings, business inventories, automobiles, etc. Now, intangible property is mostly stocks and bonds. Rich people hold most of their wealth in the form of intangible property. It is thus remarkable that in the U.S., only tangible property is subject to property tax, and tangible property is not subject to any property tax. Now, New York and some other states have actually looked at implementing a banning stock buybacks, but also doing a stock tax bill that says, hey, you rich people, when you purchase so much in stocks, you have to start paying money on that. So, I recommend checking that out as well. It's a new thing that's popping up here and there. Now, the concept of property, tangible, that many people own get taxed, but the concept of property, intangible, mostly owned by the richest minority, do not get taxed. If you own a house rented to tenants, you pay a property tax to the municipality where the house is located. You also pay an income tax on the received rents to the federal government and likely also the state government where you live. You are thus taxed twice. Once on the value of the property you own and once on the income you derive from that property. If you sell a $100,000 house and then buy $100,000 worth of shares, you will owe no property taxes to any level government in the United States. You only owe income tax on dividends paid to you and the shares you own. The former property you own determines whether you pay property tax or not. This property tax system is excellent for those rich enough to buy significant amounts of shares. The rich use their wealth to get tax laws written that way for them. The rest of us pay more in taxes because the rich pays less. Because the rich saves money, since their intangible property is not taxed, they have that much more to buy. The politicians who secure such a tax system for them, and that tax system worsens inequality of wealth and income. Unequal economic distributions finance unequal cultural outcomes. For example, the goal of a unifying, democratizing public school system has always been subverted by economic inequality. In general, with few exceptions, the better schools cost more to attend. The tutor needs to help struggling students are affordable for the rich, but less so for everyone else. The children of the wealthy get the private schools, books, choir rooms, computers, educational trips, extra arts, and music lessons, and virtually everything else needed for higher educational achievement. Unequal economic distributions finance unequal natural outcomes. The U.S. now displays two differently priced foods. Rich people can afford organic, while the rest of us worry, but still buy conventional food for budget reasons. Countless studies indicate the dangers of herbicides, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, food processing methods, and additives. Nonetheless, the two-price food system delivers the better, safer food more to the rich than everyone else. Likewise, the rich buy the safer automobiles, more safely equip their homes, and clean and filter the water they drink and the air they breathe. No wonder the rich live lives live years longer, on average, than other people. Inequality is often fatal, not just during pandemics. Now, that's not 100% correct because, like, Roundup and other herbicides, pesticides are sprayed fucking everywhere. Now I get the point, like, yes, the rich people they can buy organic foods and other organic products that are at least 99% more safer than the organics that we might find at the store. But again, if you live near a farmer's market or an Aldi or some type of like organic home grocery store, then it's very likely the products you get are not going to be sprayed on. If they are, it's going to be very little on there. So, but yes, they are able to have cleaner water and cleaner air and have better home upgrades and infrastructure than the rest of us. Now in ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle worried about and discussed the threat to community, the social cohesion posed by inequalities of wealth and income. They criticized markets as institutions because, in their view, markets facilitate and aggravate income and wealth inequalities. But modern capitalism sanctifies markets and has thus conveniently forgotten Plato's and Aristotle's cautions and warnings about markets and inequality. The thousands of years since Plato and Aristotle have seen countless critiques, reforms, and revolutions directed against wealth and income inequalities. They have rarely succeeded, and they have even more rarely persisted. Pessimists have responded, as the Bible does, with the notion that the poor shall always be with us. We rather ask the question, why did so many heroic efforts at equality fail? The answer concerns the economic system and how it organizes the people who work to produce and distribute the goods and services societies depend on. If its economic organization splits participants into a small rich minority and a large non-rich majority, the former will likely be determined to reproduce that organization over time. Slavery, master versus slave, did feudalism, lord versus serf, and capitalism, employer versus employee. Does. So inequality in the economy is a root cause to contributing to society-wide inequalities. We might then infer that an alternative economic system based on a democratically organized community producing goods and services, not split into a dominant minority and a subordinate majority, might finally end social inequality. Alright guys, so we're finally at chapter 4, thank God. It's been taking a little while, but I hope you guys did enjoy all of chapter 3. And now let's see what chapter 4 has to offer us. This is going to be interesting. So chapter 4, Capitalism and Reform. Resist, evade, weaken, and repeal. So, to start, capitalism is the reason your employer is screwing you over. So true. Few businesses show the skewed dynamics between employer and employees as clearly as Amazon. Its CEO Jeff Bezos is the world's richest person, with his wealth estimated at around $130 billion. Now again, the article is referencing from a few years ago, and him and Elon Musk have been going back and forth for a while. So he admits the near impossibility of spending these riches and commits $1 billion a year of his Amazon winnings to fund a personal project of space travel, now today known as Blue Origin. Back on Earth, Amazon's 560,000 employees earn a median salary of $28,000. Its warehouse workers face strict efficiency targets that lead some to relieve themselves in trash cans, and hundreds of Ohio's, Arizona, and Pennsylvania-based workers are found on food stamps. Or, they live on food stamps. I actually live next to, like, maybe 2 or 3 Amazon plants, like, not even half hour away from here. So, I had an idea of my experience of seeing what those places look like. So to understand why the relationship between employer and employee is so severely screwed, we have to look to capitalism. So capitalist businesses are starkly undemocratic. Employers are economic dictators. They wield enormous power and control that is unaccountable to the social majority around them, their employees, and the communities in which they live. Employees, labor produces profits, which belong 100% to the employers. Yet workers are excluded from decisions about how to use those profits. Instead, they depend on wages, set and controlled by the employer, as compensation for the work they produce. So, employers' decisions shape major aspects of employee lives, both at work and away from it. The employer alone decides which commodities to produce, what production technology to use, with what side effects, where to locate the workplace, as well as what to do with profits. Celebrations of employers' risks used to justify their profits, rarely even recognize that workers, too, take risks in their dependence on employers, but without getting profits for doing so. The skills employees develop, the personal connections they make, the seniority they accumulate, the home they invest in, the personal connections at neighborhoods, schools, churches, etc., always risk being lost or diminished by decisions exclusively in employers' hands. Above all is the decision to end a worker's job. One employee deciding to leave a business will likely make little or no impact on an employer and employers' decisions to, for example, relocate production overseas or sell or close a business carry huge risks for the employees. This undemocratic organization of production increasingly concentrates income and wealth, as well as economic power in a tiny percentage of the population. Those concentrations dominate politics as well. Fundraising for political campaigns and policies tend to rely on those with the most resources to offer. Wealth translates into political influence. The result is a system of decisions that protect and strengthen capitalism. In the realm of culture, the ideas of the top 1%, overwhelmingly capitalist, usually become the ruling ideas of the culture's arts, religions, media, and so on. There's an answer. A mechanism that can bring democracy into the workplace. Worker cooperatives, aka worker co-ops. Under the cooperative model, workers have decision-making power that corresponds to the risk and productivity of their employment. Each worker gets an equal vote on decisions which are made on a majority basis. Now remember, we employees are the majority, the employers are the tiny minority. All is shared democratically, and the company's gains and losses, and mistakes are made that threaten, weaken, or destroy the enterprise. Those mistakes will flow from the affected workers' democratic decisions. Some capitalist economies have already made concessions to workers, demanding more than undemocratic dependency. Halfway measures, such as the German concept of Beteiligung, or co-determination. For example, all workers to participate in the management of a company. Workers have also sometimes gained ownership of parts or even all the enterprises where they work. For example, employee stock ownership plans in the US. But work ownership alone is fundamentally insufficient. In most capitalist economies, such measures still exclude workers from the actual direction and control of enterprises. Worker co-ops put the workers in direct control. They democratize the direction of companies rather than just giving employees a stake in some of the management decisions. Workers decide democratically who to hire and fire as managers and direct their management activities. They become, in effect, their own board of directors. In capitalism, benefits of improvements, for example in technology, flow mostly or only one to one level, to directors, who are almost never workers as well. So, there's a little incentive for workers to look for or make improvements in the efficiency of production. The same cannot be said of workers in worker co-ops, who have the dual roles of workers and directors. Similarly, faced with opportunities for changes that increase profits but have negative environmental side effects, capitalist directors will more likely to adopt them because they usually get the profits and can escape the side effects. Employees of those directors who must bear the cost of the side effects for themselves. Their families and neighbors will give greater weight to the negative side effects versus the positive profits. Worker co-ops also move away from huge pay disparity between those at the top and those at the bottom. All workers democratically decide on wages and bonuses, making it unlikely that they would give huge salary packages to only a very few. Likewise, there are differences when it comes to the distribution of any profits or surpluses. Nothing plays a greater role in the dichotomy of 1% versus 99% than the undemocratic nature of capitalist decisions about how to distribute profits or surpluses. Capitalist employers often distribute them as top executives, salary and stock options packages, dividend payouts, buying back their company's shares, and so on. Worker cooperatives take a democratic approach. They also typically decide how much goes to, for example, advertising, research and development, politicians, artists, and civic contributions. Society is shaped in countless ways by corporate decisions about how profits are distributed. However, in worker co-ops, the decision-making structure on distributing profits is an effective mechanism to reduce poverty and income and wealth inequalities. They can, for example, devote surpluses to providing workers or area residents with social services instead of paying dividends or advertising. Their goal is providing funds to politicians who would differ, as would their contributions to cultural groups. For people to get a real choice about capitalist businesses versus worker co-ops, about what balance between them and the economy should offer, there would have to be a worker co-op sector of the U.S. economy within easy reach of all Americans. However, the U.S. economy is skewed by a government that has provided a vast array of services, tax advantages, and subsidies to capitalist businesses with nothing remotely comparable for worker co-op businesses. So, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat in New York, and recently ran for president. Complete debacle. It flopped. She's pathetic. Some good legislation, though, but really kind of unbearable in my opinion. She recently introduced legislation that would begin to rectify some of the anti-worker and anti-co-op discrimination in U.S. government policy by offering to help small businesses convert to co-ops and gain access to capital. Similarly, the Labour Party in the UK is on record with a commitment to establish a majority worker co-op sector of the UK economy if it is elected. It was not. As recent news, sucks. Hopefully they can get themselves, hopefully they can get their act together and kind of reorganize the party and become what the Labour Party was actually meant to be. So, if such a worker co-op sector were established, economy-wide, we could all vote with ballots in our wallets for whatever mix of alternative enterprises we prefer. Concrete knowledge, as well as ideological commitments, could inform democratic choices about what mix of capitalists and worker co-op enterprises best suit us, and what if Republicans and Democrats are too dependent on capitalist contributions. Perhaps we need an independent political movement or a party to advocate for building such a worker co-op segment of the economy. So, pandemic response reflects the priorities of U.S. capitalism. What is being done by the federal government in the United States is too little, too late, fundamentally ineffective, and unfair. If that's a harsh criticism, that's what it ought to be. The Fed has been pumping money into the system, but it hasn't solved the problems, neither the pandemic nor the economic meltdown. The Fed has also been cutting interest rates down to nothing. That hasn't proved to be a solution either. With the failure of monetary policy to really fix, let alone prevent, the economic collapse, we now see a turn to fiscal policy. The U.S. Treasury, Republicans, Democrats, and presidents passing a bill in excess of $2 trillion to stimulate the economy. That is also too late and too little. In the 1930s, the last time we had a depression as serious as the one we are entering now, President Roosevelt was under pressure from the unions, the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, two socialist parties, and a communist party, all of which were achieving record memberships at that time. Under the pressure, what did President Roosevelt do? Did he give everybody a check for $1,200, like the latest bill? No. He created Social Security, which we never had before, and which gave every person 65 years of age of older a check every month for the rest of their lives. But that was not the only thing he did. He also created the unemployment compensation system, which the U.S. never had. If you lost your job through no fault of your own, you got a weekly check for a year or two. Then Roosevelt went further and created a minimum wage law. The purpose of the law was to limit employers' ability to cut wages by threatening them with, if you don't like it, leave. Lots of employed people would grab that job at half of what I pay you. Roosevelt announced that if the private sector of the U.S. economy neither could nor would not hire the millions of Americans who would only ask for a job, then he, as president, would between 1934 and 1941, he created and filled 15 million jobs. For these very expensive programs, the U.S. government had little money, as masses of unemployed and bankrupt businesses paid no taxes. But it spent massively anyway, helping middle income and poor people, not just big banks, corporations, and the rich. FDR practiced trickle-up as well as trickle-down economics. He had to because of the organized political pressure from below. Now compare that to the small-minded reasoning and small amounts of money in Congress's recent stimulus bill. A one-shot deal of $200 and $500 per child. You must be kidding. That's an insult to our intelligence and our history. It is woefully inadequate to the scale of our problems, like so much this government and this private capitalist system have done. Throwing money at the crisis, as this government is doing, will not solve it because it is not simply a money problem. It's an organizational problem. We have to reorganize the economy. We can't do business the way we did. It's too dangerous. When there has to be 6 or more feet apart between people, and extensive cleaning and repeating testing, that requires a physical organization of how we do business. As a professor, I think how much we can teach. We have tens of millions of students, little babies, daycare kids, kids in elementary school, secondary school, college, and university. It's dangerous to meet in class, and the schools are all shut. But here's what we should have done. Here's what we should be planning for. Here's what we should have been doing now. You switch from a classroom teaching structure to a tutorial structure. This is a well-known tactic. With one teacher, one student, you can be 6 feet apart in a safe space, or 1 or 2 hours a day. Take millions of unemployed and put them to work. Each of them knows something and can teach it. Whatever he or she knows, whether it's typing or singing or making something in the woodshop, it doesn't matter. We could organize a one-on-one safe environment, and we should. Learning can continue if we have a pandemic. But to do reorganization like this, you have to recognize physically how the economy works. Businesses aren't doing it at all in most cases, or way too individually. Thus, progress is partial and slow. We need a massive program, that kind that can only be administered by the government. We don't have any other agency to do it. Here's why we don't have that. Because we live in a society that has always given priority to a special interest group minority calls employers. They don't want the government to come in and reorganize their business because we might find that if we don't ever want to go back. We want businesses to be done efficiently, for society as a whole, and equipped to cope with emergencies like a pandemic. We don't want the private enterprise that just failed to prepare for this virus failing now to cope with it. We want a different system. We want the workers in each workplace to run it, so it's safe for them, the majority, and the capitalists, the employers, and know this. They don't want this solution because for them, like Mr. Trump said, it's worse than a disease. Last point that you might be surprised to hear me say. Mr. Trump was recently very wise. He said, I don't want to shut down the economy. Down. Remember? He was talking about how we will all be packed into church on Easter. We'll all be going back to work and shop. And Americans were shocked. And when they were shocked, Mr. Trump, here comes his wisdom, said to us, well, we didn't shut down the automobile factories just because we had tens of thousands of people killed in car accidents every year. And that's wisdom. He's absolutely right. We don't shut down our private automobile system, despite the fact that it kills 50 to 60,000 of us every year. But of course we should have. Long ago we should have had a system of efficient, rapid, frequent buses, jittyness, street railways, regular railways. We should have an adequate, clean, attractive public transportation system. It would pollute the air less, it would kill virtually none of us, it would not waste vast amounts of raw materials. That's much more efficient. And the only reason we haven't had it is because the private capitalist system can't cope with losing the profits from private automobiles. Trump was right. And just like the current situation, they want the pandemic to run its course. 500,000 of us die, sort of like the car accident. That's what happens when capitalism reaches its end, when private profit literally trumps the public health. Alright guys, that was a long one. I do apologize that it sounded a bit quick. I was trying to, not take too long, but also still make it audible, like you guys could still hear what I was saying and be able to comprehend everything. A next video, which will probably be hopefully tomorrow or sometime later this week, I will slow down my speech a little bit just so we can take our time. But again, I just wanted to catch up and get back to where we should be. Hence because the last video is failing to record and also just the long break in between. But this is something that I feel like needs to be read and needs to be shared and to help educate the American populace on how the U.S. economy actually functions, its priorities, the amount of money that is just spent, the blank checks given to the military-industrial complex, given to Big Pharma, given to these big banks, these realtors, given to other big corporations who are not actually struggling at all. It's what they've been doing is a big fuck you to everybody else. But yeah, there's just so much that it can take a little bit to digest, but I really appreciate Dr. Wolf's little segments he gives where he breaks it down into a simpler way so that it's more understandable to us. Instead of listening to the economic legal jargon, we can just really grasp the basics of what he's talking about. And, the idea of worker co-ops, as he calls, democratizing the workplace, is becoming a thing in America, thank God. Small towns and businesses are saying, let's allow maybe a unionization drive. Or, hey, we want to own shares in the company so something happens, we can have a say and let our own workers to the board of directors, etc. So this is what's becoming, hopefully, the new America within the next decade. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. I will be adding my social media profiles to the description tab as well, so you guys can follow, say hi. My DMs are always open to anybody. So if you guys ever want to chat or have suggestions for other books after the next two I read, and some other things that's completely open, that's completely fine with me. But other than that, you guys have a great day, and that's it.